There's a road that winds through the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains, past churches with whitewashed steeples and farms, where the morning fog settles thick as cotton in the hollows. It leads to Maryville, Tennessee, a quiet town in Blount County where people once believed they knew their neighbors, where doors were left unlocked, and the worst thing that could happen was a late frost killing the dogwoods. In 1977, that innocence was shattered by a crime so cold, so calculated, that it would take nearly half a century before the truth clawed its way to the surface. This is the story of Helen and Maynard Fine, a husband and wife, parents, members of a community that trusted them and that they trusted in return. And this is the story of their son, Michael Keith Fine, who would one day stand accused of the unthinkable, of murdering the two people who gave him life. Maynard H. Fine was 67 years old in the spring of 1977. His wife, Helen D. Fine, was 54. They lived together in their home on Everett Avenue in Maryville, a modest residence in a modest town, surrounded by the ancient ridgelines of the Smokies. They were part of the fabric of this community. People who went to dinner with friends, who answered their telephone when it rang, who expected to grow old together in the shadow of those mountains. On the evening of May 6, 1977, Helen and Maynard Fine went out to dinner with friends. It was a Friday night. The dogwoods were blooming along the roadsides of Blount County, their white blossoms glowing like small lanterns in the fading light. Spring had come to East Tennessee the way it always does, slowly at first, then all at once, filling the air with the scent of honeysuckle and fresh-turned earth. They laughed, they talked, they did the ordinary things that ordinary people do on an ordinary evening. Perhaps they spoke about the garden, or about plans for the summer, or about nothing at all. The comfortable silence of a couple who had spent decades together. And then they went home, back to Everett Avenue, back to the house where they had built their life. No one outside that house would ever see them alive again. 2 weeks passed. The telephone at the Fine residence stopped working. Calls went unanswered. In a small town, silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means someone has gone on a trip. Sometimes it means the line is down. And sometimes silence means something far worse. On the morning of May 20th, 1977, at approximately 9:30, a Bell South telephone repairman arrived at the Fine residence on Everett Avenue. He had been dispatched to investigate a reported telephone issue. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. The repairman noticed Helen Fine's car parked outside the home. As he approached, the smell hit him first, that unmistakable, sickening odor that the human mind recognizes on some primal level, even before the conscious brain can name it. Inside the vehicle, he discovered the partially decomposed body of Helen Fine. She was 54 years old. She had been shot multiple times. Police were called immediately. When officers from the Maryville Police Department entered the residence, they found Maynard Fine's decomposing remains inside the home. He too had been shot multiple times. The level of decomposition was consistent with their last known sighting, nearly 2 weeks earlier. Helen and Maynard Fine had been dead since around May 6th, the very night they had returned from that final dinner with friends. The crime scene told a grim story, one that the investigators who processed it would carry with them for the rest of their careers. Someone had entered the Fine home and executed both occupants with brutal efficiency. Multiple gunshot wounds to each victim, not a single shot fired in haste, but a deliberate, methodical killing. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment. This was calculated violence, planned and executed with a cold precision that spoke of intent. Helen had somehow ended up in her car, perhaps trying to flee when she heard the gunshots, perhaps placed there after death to delay discovery. That detail haunted investigators. The image of a 54-year-old woman, desperate, running toward her vehicle in the dark, or else being carried there by her own killer. Maynard had died inside the house he had called home, the house where he had raised his family, where he had eaten his meals and read his newspaper and slept beside his wife for decades. The murder weapon was not found at the scene. Whoever had done this had taken it with them. The Maryville Police Department launched an investigation immediately. Officers fanned out across the neighborhood on Everett Avenue, knocking on doors, canvassing yards, searching for anyone who might have seen or heard something in the days following May 6th. They interviewed friends, family members, acquaintances, Anyone who had crossed paths with Helen or Maynard in the weeks before their death. They searched for the murder weapon. They dusted for fingerprints. They documented every detail of the crime scene with the meticulous care that homicide demands. 2 weeks is a long time. 2 weeks of rain, of wind, of the ordinary traffic of a neighborhood going about its business, unaware that 2 of its residents lay dead behind closed doors. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. Footprints are washed away. Tire tracks are overwritten. The Tennessee spring rain, which had been falling steadily throughout May, had done its work on any outdoor evidence. The killer had been given a 2-week head start, and that advantage proved devastating to the investigation. Detectives turned their attention to the Fine family itself. The couple had a son, Michael Keith Fine, who was approximately 34 years old at the time. In any homicide investigation, family members are examined first, not out of cruelty, but out of statistical reality. The people most likely to kill you are the people closest to you. It is the darkest truth of human violence, that betrayal and bloodshed so often share the same bloodline. But in 1977, the evidence was not enough. The investigators could not build a case that would satisfy a grand jury. There were suspicions, yes. Questions without answers. Shadows without sources. Michael Keith Fine was not charged. There was another mystery woven into this case, a thread that investigators would pull at for decades without resolution. An unidentified teenage girl had been living with the Fine family at the time of the murders. Who was she? Where did she come from? Where did she go after Helen and Maynard were killed? Police wanted to speak with her, not as a suspect, but as a potential witness, someone who might hold a crucial piece of the puzzle. Despite extensive efforts, she was never identified. She remains a ghost in this story, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the investigation's light. Approximately 1 year after the murders, in 1978, Maryville police made a significant discovery. The murder weapon, the gun used to kill Helen and Maynard Fine, was recovered from a local landfill. Someone had disposed of it, buried it among the refuse and wreckage of everyday life, hoping it would disappear forever beneath layers of garbage and dirt. But the weapon was found. It was cataloged. It was preserved. And it waited. Even with the murder weapon in hand, the case stalled. The forensic capabilities of the late 1970s had their limits. Ballistics could confirm the weapon had fired the fatal rounds, but linking a specific person to that weapon across a chain of possession was another matter entirely. DNA analysis was still a decade away from being developed as a forensic tool. Digital records did not exist. There were no databases to cross-reference, no surveillance cameras capturing grainy footage of a suspect disposing of evidence at a landfill. The connections that modern investigators take for granted, cell phone tower data, GPS tracking, email records, social media activity, electronic footprints of every kind, were the stuff of science fiction in 1978. The investigators had done everything their era allowed them to do. They had found the weapon. They had processed the scene. They had interviewed dozens of potential witnesses. But the evidence, while suggestive, was not conclusive. And without a confession, without an eyewitness, without the technological tools that would come in later decades, the Fine case went cold. Cold, that is the word they use in law enforcement when a case stops moving, when the leads dry up, when the file goes into a box and the box goes onto a shelf, and the shelf gathers dust. Cold, like the bodies of Helen and Maynard Fine in the Blount County morgue. Cold, like the silence that settled over Everett Avenue after the police tape came down. Years turned to decades. The 1970s gave way to the 80s, then the 90s, then a new millennium. Maryville grew and changed, as all small towns do. New families moved in. Old ones moved away. The generation that remembered Helen and Maynard Fine grew older, thinner, quieter. Some of them died, taking their memories with them. Michael Keith Fine, meanwhile, had left Tennessee. He crossed state lines and relocated to Alabama, settling in Jefferson County in the sprawling suburbs of the Birmingham metropolitan area. Hundreds of miles from the Smoky Mountains. Hundreds of miles from Everett Avenue. Hundreds of miles from the landfill where the murder weapon lay buried beneath years of accumulated refuse. He lived his life. He aged. He went from a man in his 30s to a man in his 40s, then his 50s, his 60s, his 70s. Each year another layer of distance between himself and that house in Maryville. Each decade another buffer of time separating the present from the past. If he thought about what had happened on Everett Avenue, he kept those thoughts to himself. The decades accumulated on him like sediment, layer upon layer, year upon year, burying the past under the weight of ordinary time. Or so he must have believed. There were people who had not forgotten. Family members of Helen and Maynard Fine carried the weight of their unsolved murders like stones in their pockets. Every holiday was a reminder. Every family gathering had 2 empty chairs. The questions never stopped echoing. Who killed them? Why? Will anyone ever be held to account? In May of 2021, 44 years after the murders, one of those family members made a phone call to the Maryville Police Department. It was a simple inquiry, a question about the status of the case, a quiet refusal to let the dead be forgotten. That phone call changed everything. The Maryville Police Department reopened the Fine case. New detectives brought fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques to evidence that had been preserved for over 4 decades. They re-examined the murder weapon recovered from the landfill in 1978. They reviewed old interviews, old reports, old photographs. They applied the tools of 21st century forensic science to a crime committed in the age of rotary telephones and carbon paper. What they found was damning. Investigators were able to connect Michael Keith Fine to the entry point of the residence. They linked him to the murder weapon that had been used to kill his parents. The evidence that had eluded investigators in 1977 was now, with the benefit of modern analysis, pointing directly at the victim's own son. On November 7th, 2023, a Blount County grand jury returned an indictment against Michael Keith Fine. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The charges carried the weight of nearly half a century of silence. The following day, November 8th, the Maryville Police Department held a press conference. Michael Keith Fine had been arrested in Birmingham, Jefferson County, Alabama. He was 80 years old, an old man living out the twilight of his life in a state far from the mountains where his parents had died. But Tennessee has no statute of limitations for first-degree murder. Time may dull the blade of justice, but it does not sheathe it. Maryville Police Chief Tony Crisp stood before the cameras and described the arrest as rewarding. His words were simple but resonant. It didn't end in 1977, he said. No one's forgotten. Those words carried decades of institutional determination. A department that refused to close the book on its oldest unsolved homicide. The news sent ripples through the true crime community, through the town of Maryville itself. People magazine, Law and Crime, and local news stations across East Tennessee covered the story. An 80-year-old man arrested for murdering his own parents nearly 50 years earlier. The headlines wrote themselves. Television crews set up outside the Blount County Courthouse. Reporters called the Maryville Police Department requesting interviews. Social media erupted with commentary, debate, and the inevitable question that haunts every cold case arrest. Why did it take so long? For the family of Helen and Maynard Fine, the arrest was bittersweet. Decades of silence, decades of not knowing, decades of watching their loved ones' murders gather dust in a filing cabinet had finally given way to action. But the people who had known Helen and Maynard best, their closest friends, their contemporaries, were largely gone now. The world that had existed in 1977, the world where the Fines had lived and laughed and gone to dinner on a spring evening, that world had vanished as completely as the victims themselves. But the story did not end with handcuffs and a press conference. Justice, it seems, has a cruel sense of timing. September of 2024, Fine's defense attorneys filed a motion to dismiss the charges. Their argument was rooted not in innocence, but in fairness. Too much time had passed, they argued. Witnesses had died. Evidence had degraded. Memories had faded beyond reliability. Michael Keith Fine, they contended, could not receive a fair trial nearly 5 decades after the alleged crimes. The motion worked its way through the Blount County court system until it reached the desk of Circuit Court Judge Tammy M. Harrington. On August 15, 2025, Judge Harrington issued her ruling. She sided with the defense, citing what she called an insurmountable disadvantage. The passage of 46 years between the killings and the indictment had made a fair trial impossible. The case was dismissed at cost to the state. Michael Keith Fine would not be responsible for any court costs. He would not stand trial. He would not sit in a witness box and hear the evidence against him presented to 12 citizens of Blount County. He would not face a jury of his peers. He would not hear a verdict read aloud in forgot courtroom under the fluorescent lights of modern justice. He would walk away from the courthouse as he had walked away from Everett Avenue all those decades ago. Free, uncharged, unpunished. The legal reasoning was sound, perhaps even correct. A person has a constitutional right to a fair trial, and a trial conducted nearly 50 years after the alleged crime, with witnesses dead, evidence degraded, and memories faded to nothing, could hardly be called fair. But sound legal reasoning is cold comfort to a family that has waited 46 years for answers. The dismissal left the victim's family devastated. After years of hoping, after that phone call in 2021 that had breathed new life into the investigation, after the grand jury indictment that had seemed like vindication, the courthouse doors closed. Helen and Maynard Fine's murders remain officially unresolved. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it means when a crime goes unpunished, not because the evidence is insufficient, but because too much time has passed. Think about the family members who carry that burden, who live with the knowledge that investigators believe they had their man, that a grand jury agreed, that the evidence pointed to one person, their own flesh and blood, and yet the law, in its mechanical fairness, determined that the wheels of justice had turned too slowly to be just. There is a particular horror in familicide that sets it apart from other forms of murder. When a stranger kills, we can understand it as an intrusion, an outside force breaking into our lives. But when a son kills his parents, the violence comes from inside the house, from the very person those parents raised, fed, loved, and trusted. It is betrayal in its most absolute form, the corruption of the most sacred bond that exists between human beings. Helen Fine was 54 years old. She had decades of life ahead of her. Maynard Fine was 67, older, but by no means finished with living. They went to dinner with friends on a May evening in 1977. They came home. And someone was waiting for them, or followed them, or was already inside. Someone with a gun and a purpose so dark that it defies comprehension. The Fine family murders remain one of Maryville's most haunting cases, a wound in the town's history that has never fully healed. The home on Everett Avenue still stands in the shadow of the Smoky Mountains, though the people who live there are long gone. The telephone repairman who found Helen Fine's body has carried that memory for nearly 50 years. The family members who made that call in 2021 still wait for a justice that may never come. And Michael Keith Fine, now in his 80s, lives on. The courts have spoken, the case is dismissed, but dismissed is not the same as resolved. Dismissed is not the same as innocent. And the dead do not forget, even when the living are forced to move on. In the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains, the fog still settles in the hollows each morning. The churches still lift their white steeples toward the sky. And somewhere on Everett Avenue, if you listen carefully enough, the silence still tells its story. A story of 2 lives taken, a family torn apart, and a betrayal that time could not heal and the law could not punish. Some cases end with a verdict, some end with a confession, and some, like the murders of Helen and Maynard Fine, end with nothing but questions, carried on the mountain wind, unanswered, unanswerable, forever.